The idea of the colonial education is inseparable and rooted in the very idea of Western modernity. A school is not a school if it does not allow us to be better human. How do you teach somebody to have a good life? How do you give somebody the skills that would lead them to have a good life? That is another way to thinking. What is development? What is a good social and political structure? And what not? And those questions are fundamental and essential and will allow us to think about the very nature of our school system.
Hello and welcome to Unpopular Opinion Podcast, a platform for bold and uncompromising discussion on African politics, development, history, societal challenges, and Pan-Africanism. In today's edition of Unpopular Opinion, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Sheikh Chan. He is a professor of English and Black Studies at the Emirates College, the author of Negritude Reloaded, and epistemologist from the South. He has agreed to sit with us in this edition of Unpopular Opinion to discuss colonial education and how Europe brainwashed Africans. His work confronts the legacy of colonial education. He advocates for Pan-African centered epistemologies as well as interrogates or investigates the dominance of Western narratives in African learning. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. It is indeed an exciting opportunity for us to have you. I want us to, or I would like for you to define what is colonial education and how do you think that the West or Europe was able to bring a system to that would be able to allow them to have control over their minds, identity, and the future of African.
Hmm. Um, so, Mohammed, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to enter in conversation with you. Wow, that's an interesting question, and there are two ways to to answer it. One is a very literal way to answer it. It's that they brought in with colonization their schools, built it with bricks and water, and taught whatever they wanted to teach us. But now I think your question is more complex than that, right? It's the idea of the colonial education itself. As you know, colonization is not just an occupation of land; it's also and fundamentally rooted in coloniality and therefore a way to occupy the brains, right? You cannot. It is essential, right? You cannot colonize the people if you don't colonize their minds. So we can say that colonization, the idea of the colonial education, is inseparable and rooted in the very idea of Western modernity, um, um, in the sense that um, um, these institutions earlier on, at least, were founded in order to control Africans and African minds. First, by defining um, the idea of the human in a certain way and presenting us and making us accept what we are not. That we weren't human and therefore we were made to be controlled. Uh, like these schools functioned differently from one place to another. But in many ways, most of the colonial schools, at least the schools during colonizations, were schools that were created and set up so that to train Africans, so that they could do the work that the Western that their colonizers wanted to do. So these schools in the beginning would just train us to be sort of intermediaries, but none of these schools were meant to make us agents, if that's what you mean. On the other hand, though, if you're talking about the very idea of the Western school on the continent as a colonial school, then that's a different story. So maybe if you just want to elaborate a little bit more, I'll be able to answer your question better.
I want us to elaborate more on the Western school system within the continent. That's what I meant.
Okay, so the type of school that we have today as colonial schools, right? And I think we have, there's sort of a consensus, right? That the schools that we have today are rooted they're nothing but continuations of the colonial schools, right? Most of the schools, at least the so-called modern schools that we have, the languages in which they are taught, English, French, Portuguese in most instances, the type of curricula that we have, the pedagogies that we use, are all in one way or another continuation of or mirrors of Western school systems, right? These schools train mostly in most of our places as colonial schools, especially in Francophone Africa, train Africans in languages, but also in ways in which that do not uh, relate to who we are. There is clearly, in general, on the continent, a disconnect between our own understandings of the world and the colonial schools themselves. It is not rare to see and hear that not only, as I said earlier, the language that we speak, but most of the curricula are nothing but some imitations and mirrors of whatever is taught in the West, and all of that are rooted again in the very idea of the being that's fundamental to Europe. Because at the end of the day, what is a school, and what do we do in schools, right? You go to school because you want to train people. You train them, you educate them to be better humans, right? I'm exaggerating, like better humans, because in schools, the idea of the liberal arts in themselves, humanities, make you a better human being. But also, in schools, you're trained to get skills so that you can get a job in some ways, right? Or do something. And in both instances, just thinking about it, in both instances, those are very cultural things, if you want to understand what a human being is, what a good school is, you must try to think of how the culture that understands the school considers a human being, right? The definition of the human itself determines, or at least should determine, the type of school that you have, right? And we know that most of us, at least in the modern states, in our so-called modern states, understand the idea of the human as the human of the 18th century, right? The modern European human. While usually in our cultures, in many African cultures, the idea of the human itself is understood differently. Let me give you a simple example, right? The idea of the modern human is based on the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And we also know now, at least, that the idea of the cogito, the I think, therefore I am, is not just representative of a universal subject. The people who define during that moment, be it Descartes, but also the entire modern space that understood the human in a certain way, were also defining those who were not human, us. In that sense, thinking of a school that is fundamentally rooted in the universal idea of the subject necessarily should make us African think twice, right? Now let's go back to some African traditions in general and African cultures. We also understand that the human.
Before we go to those traditions, and I just want to bring in something first because there are a lot we need to talk about. I mean, you've said a lot of things in your opening statements, and we need to just explore most of the, or I mean, all of them in detail. Before we go to that point, I want to ask you: do you think it's possible to decolonize the educational curriculum in Africa right now? And what does it truly mean to decolonize the curriculum? Do you think this decolonization, is it just about history, or what is it really about?
I think it can be about history, right? But saying this what I was talking about is actually, I think, will help us answer this question, right? So as I said, the idea of the human as an individual subject that is defined in relation to what it is not. The Western subject that I talked about uh, is the subject that is not Western. What I'm saying here is, when that subject was defined, it was also a way to understand and define the non-Western subject as non-human, and it's around that idea of the human that the colonial school was built. Now, what I'm saying is, Now, think about other cultures, like African cultures, where the idea of the subject or the human is defined not in terms of the individual subject, but in terms of performance of humanity, right? For example, in Wolof, we say nit. What is the human? Nit nite, my garbo. You are human when you are useful to other humans. Now, why am I saying that this is related to your question? If you want to decolonize the school, you have to start by imagining or thinking about the very idea of the human as the ideal differently. So, in a school built around the idea of the modern subject, a certain curriculum must be taught. A certain understanding of being must be taught. And you must teach in a certain way. In another school, where what matters most is not necessarily the individual, but what makes the community work, then a different way of understanding the school must be taught. But what I'm saying here is, if we want to decolonize the African school, we have to start from the beginning, which is what is the human, which will ultimately define what is a school, what is teaching, and what not. So that's the first way. The first engagement with the school comes with a definition, a redefinition of the human, and therefore a redefinition of the very idea of a school. That's one thing. Second, now, to answer your question in a different way with more practical things, of course. What is a curriculum? Why do we have one curriculum and not another? In that way, what curriculum should we teach in one African place versus in other places in the world? To be African, I think we should first start by acknowledging and understanding that Africa is a fundamentally diverse space. And therefore, try to think about the possibility of school curricula that are fundamentally diverse and linked to particular communities. A school is not a school if it does not allow us to be better human. A school is not a school if it doesn't allow us to be more useful in our community first, but also to the world. So the question is, what should different schools from different communities look like? It is from that moment that that curricula linked to small entities and particular entities should be developed. Being African is being understanding fluidity and diversity. The most African epistemologies do not engage with essences. That is why engaging with ideas of curricula, ideas of schools and stuff is something very complex on the continent, because it entails the possibility of diversity and fluidity. It's messy, maybe less efficient, but more real and probably more useful at the individual level. Third, something that I think is essential, and many other things that are essential, is in what language should we speak? It's what language should we teach? Those are questions that are essential. I just had this really, really interesting experience at Dakar University when we organized sort of a conference and realized the limits of Dakar University students with the French language. In a space like that, and again, I am also one of the people who are not saying, I don't think that French is necessarily a foreign language or English is necessarily a foreign language. In that sense, I'm not a decolonial scholar. However, what is clear is from one community to another, we engage with local languages differently, and therefore should think more about how to engage and include local languages in the ways in which we teach and learn. We will never be able to teach efficiently if we don't teach in languages that speak more and better to the communities. Languages that have concepts that engage more with our relation to the world and with our relations to ourselves. In some African communities, it's the so-called European languages for sure. In others, it's more local languages. So anyway, my take here is, let's remember that the ways in which we define the human being should determine the ways in which we organize our schools and choose our curricula. The ways in which we define the human being differs from one place to another, and our schools should be adapted to that. Our curricula should be adapted to that. So should be our pedagogies and the ways in which we think of the future.
Thank you so much for that explanation. And to our audience, I'd like to encourage you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you are enjoying this conversation. I want to also look at the African philosophies. Do you think it is possible to integrate African philosophies into modern day educational or practical education in Africa, such as the Ubuntu, the storytelling, and our indigenous sciences?
Of course, when that's where we should start, right? So I hear if I understand your question very well, because to me, it's very hard to talk about African philosophy because there's so many ways in which we philosophize in Africa. But should we use the concept of Ubuntu in the ways in which we engage with the world, in the ways in which we teach? And what other concept did you talk about again?
Like our storytelling concept and indigenous sciences.
So storytelling concepts and indigenous, of course, and indigenous. And these are three actually very, very interesting points that you try to make, right? Ubuntu links us back to the point I was talking about before. What is Ubuntu? At the end of the day, it is a way of understanding the idea of the subject and the person in collaboration. But that also leads us to what is a good life, right? Understanding the question of Ubuntu leads us to better understand what is the question of a good life. And understanding the question of a good life necessarily leads us to try to think of what is it that we should teach in our schools. Are you going to teach our students just a way to get a job and make money? That is linked to the idea of a good life from a very European perspective. But what is it that really matters most in a culture where Ubuntu is the foundation of life? How do you teach somebody to get to have a good life? How do you give somebody the skills that would lead them to have a good life? That is another way to thinking. What is development? What is a good social and political structure? And what not? And those questions are fundamental and essential and will allow us to think about the very nature of our school system. And the second point that you were making, storytelling. Look, that leads us to another way of understanding teaching and learning. Because here, you're gesturing towards what pedagogy we should use, right? In most of let's also remember, right? Like I am not the type of people who just define Africa as this thing that's linked that was there in the past. In many instances, I think being African is fundamentally being diverse, right? And even in many ways, Creole, right? Africa is this thing. I don't know who was saying again that ancestors are born every single day. We have engaged with Western modernity in ways, in many ways, participated in making it what it is and shifting it. It has also participated, modernity itself, in making us who we are and what we have become. We are not people of the past. We are fundamentally present and becoming people. And that's the very idea of Africa. I tend to say that rootedness and essences, like claiming rootedness and essences is a Black way of being white. Essentially, being Africa can change this. Why am I saying this? Storytelling in many African spaces does constitute the ways in which we engage with the world, we engage with learning and teaching. The fundamental question that but that's not the only one, right? But yet, what can storytelling do? That's a fundamental question that we must ask ourselves. What can it do for us? What can it do in classrooms? And who are we as a people and as people who are fundamentally different? And what is our relation to storytelling? And how can that make us learn not just Africans, by the way, but the world beyond Africa, right? Because let's not just essentialize Africa. We engage with storytelling in fundamentally in many ways, right? Not just storytelling, but orality itself also becomes really important. You're absolutely right. In the beginning, when we talked about Eurocentrism, European ways of brainwashing us, that has happened, and I talked about how the idea of the European human was a way to dehumanize Africa. That's also part of who we are today. But here, there's one thing that was very important in that instance. It is sort of the story of the primacy of writing. Right? It is through this glorification of writing that Africans as or people of orality were dehumanized, right? But more and more, especially now, we realize that orality has in itself something that very vibrant, diverse, and fluid that can allow us to understand the world in its diversity that writing does not always allow us to do. So what do we lose when we just focus on this sort of glorification of writing that lead us to completely forget orality in the ways in which we engage with teaching and learning? Those are questions that we need to ask. And I think in many ways, African cultures have used orality to not only create knowledge, pass knowledge, but also to engage with the world beyond the simple, superficial act of defining it. Orality is that which has allowed us, especially those of us who believe that I am because you are, to engage with each other in respectful ways, in loving ways, in very African ways, acknowledging our differences and everything that we have in common in our common humanities. And in that sense, storytelling becomes an essential tool that we should use not only on the continent but also beyond. And to finish, indigenous technologies. Of course, I'm glad you asked this question. One of the very dangerous things that we have done, one of the very normal things of Western modernity is again to define our engagement with the world as not human enough. And unfortunately, on the continent, that's exactly what has happened. Exactly what has happened in such a way that you and I probably know more Western science than we know African science and technologies. Where are those African science and technologies? How do we engage with them? And we do, right? They're here. If they have not been destroyed, we just have not learned to see them. We have not learned to listen. And sometimes the fact that we have taken them out of the official realm has limited our abilities and our capacities to control, to regulate, and to test them. Take the example of the doctors, the traditional doctors in countries like Senegal. It's precisely because it's not lawful that anyone can just show up and claim that science. That's why there's so many charlatans. But imagine if this was an organized and lawful science acknowledged, then we would be able to better understand it. So our technologies are here. Let's engage with them. Let's bring them to the classroom and treat them the way we should treat ourselves as humans who, for thousands of years, have lived, observed nature, created science, and solved our problems.
To our audience, if you'd like to see us in quality studio, if you'd like to see us with a better microphone, if you want to see our podcast growing very far and beyond, we encourage you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel as well as recommend this podcast to your friends and family members to also be subscribers. I want us to look at the issue of language. Language has become a major issue. You talked about it from your opening statement about like French, English, Portuguese. These are formal languages that are being taught in various schools across. And if you are not familiar with any of these languages or you are not able to speak any of them, you are considered quote unquote uneducated. So, how do you think we can be able to move away from this issue of language in terms of being taught in school system, but to introduce our own local languages in which students will be able to live, I mean, will be able to understand and interact with directly, not through flow of nature?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question, right? I'm going to start by saying something that will not be popular in this channel. It is that I do not think the so called European languages are.
That is sorry. That is why it is called unpopular opinion. So we don't like to say things that are very popular here.
So I do not think that these languages aren't African languages, right? The so-called European languages. Of course, they came from somewhere else. They were imposed on us, but we took them. We've lived with them for hundreds of years. So how can they not be ours? That said, um, in what I'm saying this precisely because you often hear people talk about going back to African languages, leaving, and that's the case in Senegal, for example. Like we hear more and more about the possibility of leaving French and going back to African languages. I completely disagree with that. I believe that these languages are ours. We have taken them, used them, transformed them. They have transformed us. And there's no way of going back in time. That said, our local languages should have the same dignity as all other languages that got here at a certain point in time. There's no culture that will engage with the world without a clear commitment to develop their languages. Our languages, our local languages, must be languages of science, languages of literature, and languages of philosophy if we want to understand the ways in which we relate and engage with the world. So, of course, we will make it only and only if we teach our languages, read, write them, and produce knowledge in them. That is fundamental. And that should start as early as possible. Again, that is a very difficult thing because often you hear people say, oh, let's use Swahili. Yes, use Arabic. Yes, let's use Fulani. As I said before, very often we want to be African by using the same methodology that Europeans used, which is imposing one single language. You take the example of Senegal today. The most dangerous language for smaller languages is not French, it's Wolof. These African languages, if we use them and impose them as essential languages, as languages of domination, as major languages, have the tendency to destroy what to me is fundamentally African, which is accepting our diversity and our pluralities. So, yes, languages of science, but in their pluralities. Africans are plural people. Let's take our languages in general. Let's learn as many as possible. And let's not think that one language is essential or as imposing major languages are important. Yes, to local languages, but yes, most importantly, to the plurality of local languages. Because being African is precisely that. It's not opposing Europe by creating something that is not them and essentializing them in the same way, but it's thinking from our own perspective, which is a perspective that acknowledges the possibilities of meanings and languages for that matter, including the so-called European languages. So that's essential because we think in language. Thinking, we have the impression that the very nature of language is to translate what is in our thoughts. But it is hard sometimes to determine what precedes what, the language or the thought.
Absolutely, I'm actually enjoying this conversation a lot. I mean, it's really fascinating to be able to speak about African languages, African culture, our educational system in a context that absolutely translates our reality. And, when you were talking about languages, something that came to my mind was that, I'm a Madingo and there's an Unko language. And majority of the young people, or majority of the people, you can even say up to 80 to 90% of the people, do not know how to read and write this Nko language. Most of the people are familiar with English, French, Portuguese, or other languages that we consider to be foreign languages within the vicinity of our culture. And before, for me, I think before we are accusing other languages to be For us to change other languages, it is for us to be able to learn our own languages, know how to speak it. Because if you go to most of the homes today, a lot of people, even within Africa, do not speak their own language, do not understand their native language. And how do we encourage people to be able to speak their own languages, to see value in what they speak, to see value in their own identity, instead of romanticizing other people's culture? Like you said, language has been spoken widely in a nation. That language is the one that dominates other smaller languages. How do we change all of those narratives in order to accommodate every languages, so that everyone feels a part of the system and as a whole? Having said that, I want us to look at how do we reclaim and recenter African memories. Like we talk about the Ubuntu and other philosophical sciences in Africa, through without being in our to recenter them in a way that it should be a fulcrum of our educational system, and not to be accused of being anti-West or romanticizing the past as well. How do we do that?
Look, it's there's bad faith in whenever people accuse us, most of the time, when people accuse us of romanticizing the past because we say that it is essential to understand ourselves and our languages, that's really based on bad faith, right? We often do not say that we should. I mean, some people do, but most of us do not necessarily say that we should say farewell to you, right? I was just talking a couple of no, I was it was actually last year. I was talking to a group of students who told us, "Oh, let's leave um, the French language and start teaching and talking in African languages." And I said, "Look, how do you say I love you in Wolof without translating it?" And then I said, "Look, the truth is that these languages are part of us in many ways, right? Because we have become different, and that's real. Just 2 generations ago, marriages were about two different families. Now, you, Mohammed, or me, or anyone else, you fall in love with one person, you get married to them. That's a very European understanding of marriage, right? But that's how we are today. So there's no way of going back in time, and we probably don't even want to go back in time. And therefore, in that sense, love being so central in the primary unit of the society, and you say, I love you in French in many instances. Some people will question me, but I bet you in many instances, in many African languages, love is not something that you say, it's something that you engage with, it's something that you show. I have a professor that used to say, when you say I love you, love is not there anymore. Anyway, what I'm saying here now is that these languages, as I said earlier, uh, are part of us. Now, that said, how do we center our memories? Again, this takes us back to where we started, right? The reason why we center European memories, the reason why we speak French and English and Portuguese and Spanish at home, the reason why we wake up every day and try to be as white as possible is that we understand and acknowledge and agree with the fact that the ideal human is the modern subject. And the modern subject is the subject that is not African. That's why we wake up every single day, especially the middle class, and try to be white. When Fanon said that there's only one destiny for the black man, and it is to be white in the colonial space, it is because the ideal of the human is white, and the non-white, the black person, the Negro, or however you call them, is the contrary of the human being. If you are in a space like that and you understand the world like that, it is just normal that you wake up every single day and try to be white. You speak French at home because it humanizes you. You eat European stuff at home because it humanizes you. You eat at table, as we say here, on a table and not around your bowl because it humanizes you, right? So let's go back to understanding what is essentially a human, to teaching us that the dehumanization of the African is neither scientific nor rational nor natural. It is that engagement with knowledge and knowledge production that will lead us to think about ourselves differently and understand that essentially all languages are the same as long as they celebrate our own humanity and mark the diversity of the humans that live in this world today. In other words, the question, like seriously, like speak, all these issues that I've mentioned are the effects of the real problem, which is how do we understand ourselves and how do we escape the representation of the world that have presented us as non-human and that have led us to try to mimic and imitate the other and run away from who we essentially are. The day that we will understand that this was a setup, an invention in order to better exploit us, that day we will try to understand what is the very meaning of the human in our communities, in our relation to all these languages and all these European impositions will completely change. Education, the problem, as Du Bois said, is ignorance. The cure is education.
This video is proudly sponsored by Magnite clothing brand. If you are living in Europe or in any part of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them up on their Instagram page or on their website. The links are in the description of this video. I want us to look at how do we ensure that we decolonize curriculum and prepare students not just to understand themselves, but to also be able to compete globally without losing their roots.
Uh, I think if we really decolonize, our people will naturally be able to compete globally. The problem, I think, that has led Africans to not be able to compete globally is that we have spent all our times trying to catch up, but trying to be the other. What we have fundamentally as Africans is the possibility to not only be rooted, but also to understanding very well what's outside of our continent. Like imagine if you and I, Mohammed, were going to get into a competition, but I know very well who you are and also know very well who I am, but you don't know anything about me. Who would be more likely to win? And if we like it or not, being African, essentially, but also historically, again, is being open to diversity and difference. I often say that one of the reasons why we are polytheistic is that we don't believe in essential truth and we accept difference and otherness. So, in that sense, these knowledges that constitute the so-called modern European knowledges are things that we ought to know and we ought to learn. I am not one of the people who say let's forget it and go back to some as African things that existed in the past. But we should add to that technologies, indigenous technologies, conceptions of the world that roots us in our world. So decolonizing here is not necessarily delinking to me. It's understanding very well the nature of modernity, yet being completely rooted in our own African local engagement in the world in order to enrich us as we move forward. That's why I'm very careful actually with the term decolonial or the concept of decoloniality, because decoloniality is a concept that is rooted in a particular history. Of course, I want to go beyond Eurocentrism and the idea of the universal European self, but I see an engagement that will add to who we are while avoiding, of course, the dehumanization of African Africans. That training, I think, will get us ready to engage with the world in ways that at least those from the global north who sit who think that they sit on truth and therefore are unable to understand otherness and difference will not be able to engage. The future of the world, I think, is will value more people who think differently, talent, who can create beyond the limits of what ChatGPT and AI can create, and we have it all on the continent to engage in those ways. So yes, let's be real. Let's understand and and engage from an African perspective. But engaging from an African perspective is not a way to completely detach from the West. It's an addition that is fundamentally rooted in who we are.
We are almost coming to the end of this edition. I have one more question. I'd like to just ask you about this. What role do you think history is playing in post-colonial African future, as well as what would it look like decolonizing the African curriculum? What would it look like in the universities, and what set of people will be produced, and what kind of mindset will be produced from the university to be able to, what contribution do you think they will be able to make to the larger society?
It's exactly what I said earlier, right? But what do you mean history? What history?
I'm talking about colonial history.
Look, nothing comes from nothing. And fundamentally, I think well, at least for the Wolof, for the Syria, for the Dogon, for the Bambara, for many African cultures, um, time is an enduring um, engagement with the fluidity of life. Right. In that sense, we do not often consider a past as separate from the present, as separate from the future. So history is imbricated in many ways with the present, right? Uh, in that sense, all African histories and all the ancestors that were born, that are being born, should allow us to engage with our present and our future. This is why I'm saying it's exactly what I was saying earlier before. So we have to engage with our reality, taking into consideration all our histories, including our engagement with modernity, which have shifted us in ways that we are unable to pinpoint, right? And it's this diversity of being African that makes us rich and ready and engage with the world in ways that those who dominate and don't take the time to learn and engage and change and transform have not gotten. So, who are we as people who are fundamentally diverse, who have learned from our own mistakes, who have been put in certain situations, but who also know that we are so many different things? How do we engage the world? And how do we teach? How do we learn? Those are fundamental questions. But I think that we have the potential to do it in ways that others can't. As a matter of fact, you and I are here today speaking in English. I'm sure as soon as you hang up, you're going to talk to your nephew in a different language. How many people in the world can do that? So take us in a bank to a university. Think about the type of struggles that we go through, that we've recently went through. How does that prepare us? How do we bring that to the classroom? Think about orality. Think about storytelling. How many people can tell stories to teach and learn? But we can also read books and write books, right? So what is it that we bring? How many things do we have the potential of bringing if we take ourselves seriously, take our history seriously, and not delink necessarily, unless delinking only means detaching from the Eurocentric, universalizing, and dehumanizing perspective of Western modernity.
You know, before we take a leave of you, there's one something that just came to my mind. That is the book that you authored, Degraded Reloaded, and Epistemologies from the South. Would like for you to please, talk about the book. What was the motivation behind the book, and what message you were trying to portray, as well as, is there any final words before we can take a leave of you, or were you expecting us to ask some questions or setting specific question and we did not ask? You can elaborate on that as well.
As an African, I believe in conversations of the moment and no expectations at all. So I wasn't expecting any particular question that was asked and that wasn't asked. I was just expecting a conversation that could go anywhere. And I'm glad we had a conversation and thought together about these issues. My both books were ways of thinking and reading Senghor. As a matter of fact, uh, and putting Senghor in conversation with African studies in general. My first book, Negritude Reloaded. No, Negritude Reloaded was not my first book. It's a special issue that I did with the Journal of African Philosophy. But my first book was um, um, I'm forgetting of it, but it was about it was um, Return to the Kingdom of Childhood, envisioning the philosophical relevance of negritude. And what I did in that book is just do a very close reading of negritude, sort of a hermeneutics of negritude. Senghor had been defined and presented for a very long time as a Eurocentric scholar, a scholar of the past who was essentialized and that we shouldn't read anymore. And I just asked myself, what would happen if I did a very close reading of everything, all the philosophical work that Senghor had done? And what I came up with is that if we do that, then we realize that he can be read as a African as a Africa-centered philosophy that proposes nothing less but an African epistemology and an African ontology that is similar to the Serer, Wolof, and Bambara understandings of the world, rather than how it was often defined. And after that book, I realized that another question needed to be asked, which is, it seems that since the 1950s, most of African philosophy, most of African knowledge production has been in one way or another in conversation in Senghor. And I assumed, and most of African philosophy is done in English. And as I argued in my first book, there has been sort of a misreading of negritude, right, as a Eurocentric philosopher. So I asked myself, if negritude is not a Eurocentric philosopher, and if most of African philosophy and African and Caribbean Africana philosophy has been in conversation of negritude as a Eurocentric philosophy, and now that I have presented as something else, how do we read or reread pivotal moments in African studies again in light of Senghor's philosophy? That's what I did in the second book. And now what I would like to share is, again, as I said, I think that we had misread Leopold Sedar Senghor because most of us speak English and English only. Well, at least don't speak French, while Senghor wrote in French. So most people that you hear in African studies who only speak English and who talk about Senghor have not read Senghor precisely because he's not available in English. And the reason why I'm saying this is that soon you will see in the winter that we will produce. I am working with two of my colleagues, Doyle Calhoun and Alun Badawafal, and we have just finished the first translated edition of the essential readings of Senghor's philosophy. So all those who don't speak French and who have not yet had access to Senghor will have access to most of his philosophical writing.
This brings us to the end of today's edition of Unpopular Opinion. It has been indeed an absolute honor to have you.
All right, cool.
Thank you so much, Prof, for being our guest. And to our listeners, if this conversation moved you, we encourage you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as like, comment, share, and encourage your friends and family members to be subscribers. We also encourage you to keep this conversation alive, keep engaged, keep informed, and remain unapologetically Africans. Until we meet again, peace everywhere in the African continent.